Now, there are some permutations, shall we say, to everything. When Pfeiffer came to this country, he talked about preparations to the farmers and the gardeners, and most of the biodynamic effort in this country was done through backyard gardeners. Sorry to say, the farmers could not quite wrap their heads around it. And in particular, the weird way some of these preparations are made. I mean, after all, stuffing manure into a cow horn and burying it for the winter? Are you kidding? Oak bark ground up and put in the skull of a domestic animal and buried in a swampy place for the winter? You're out of your gourd. You have to be. Well, the practical farmer in this country couldn't quite get next to it. So Pfeiffer came, after a number of years of hard work, he came up with Compost Starter. Our version of it we call Compost Activator. It's got all the compost preparations in it. It's a dry powder. You moisten it 12 hours before you intend to use it. You build your compost pile in layers and you spray each layer as you're building. Or if you've got a compost pile already built, you poke holes in it and you pour a certain amount of this into each hole. I said activated with water 12 hours before you intend to use it, and then you add more water, enough to use in a sprayer to spray the pile, or you can take a bucket and a whisk broom and just address your pile that way. And sprayer on your garden beds, again, just a whisk broom and a bucket. Flick the droplets on the soil with the 500 especially. The 501 wants to be a little finer mist, ideally, and so for that you might want the sprayer, a bona fide sprayer. So that's how they're applied. And again, a fine mist sprayer gives you a spray for the atmosphere, the air around the plants, so that the plant breathes in through the stomata on the underside of the leaf. The plant breathes in the moisture that is saturated with the silica cosmic forces, and it connects that plant to the rest of the universe somehow.
You said with the 500 you want to go to the soil, or if you're grazing you want to do it after you graze.
Yeah, when the growth is low. Now, spraying it directly on plants when they're full up is not going to hurt them. It's going to help them, but it's the soil you want mostly to affect. So
for the 500 or 501?
That's for the 500. The 501, the orthodox approach is that it is a foliar spray on growing plants. I have done an experiment doing a sequence of the preparations. I had 2 garden beds, both growing the same crop. Broccoli was the main one in both beds. I did a sequence on bed 1 with BC 500, 501 on the bare soil, and 508. So that was that sequence. On the next bed, bed number 2, I did BC and 500. I may or may not have done 508, but it didn't have any 501. Later on in the growing season, the difference between the broccoli plants from one bed to the other, these were upright, crystalline in appearance, and little or no cabbage worms. The little caterpillar-like critters that get on broccoli and make it hard to clean. Now, for that experiment, I deliberately used bought-in plants. I didn't start them myself in that instance. The bed not sprayed with the 501, they looked a little sloppy, and they had plenty of cabbage worms. So there's a difference. Is that scientific? No. And has anybody else been encouraged to try that experiment? I don't think so. I haven't heard about it. Nobody's given me feedback. But it's an experiment worth trying. You had a question, sir.
In terms of biodynamic farming, do y'all use things like BT for cabbage worms?
Prefer not. if you're desperate for a harvestable crop, you might choose to. You have a natural situation. If you bring in the BT, you're introducing an organism that was not there to begin with. Why are the cabbage worms there?
Food source.
High carb.
Their food source, which takes away your food source. All right. But why are they there? They're there because the soil is not healthy. The biodynamic remedy for healthy soil is to use the preparations, and in my description of that, it's to use all 9 of the preparations. And with diligence, frequently, the faster you do that, the more often you do that, the sooner will your soils turn around. And yes, you can use it. And in fact, you can use Roundup, but you're a damn fool if you do. But if you know, it depends on what your choices are. And some of those choices are a moral choice. And we no longer recognize that farming has a lot of moral choices in it. I'm not trying to condemn anybody, but we need to recognize what we do and why we do it. You have insect, pest in particular, because the plant is growing in soil that is not fully healthy. And the biodynamics will help change that soil over time to healthy soil. Now, one thing in biodynamics that does not get mentioned often enough, and except by someone like Podolinsky in Australia, you have to make sure you've got enough minerals in your soil. He often recommended using rock powders to do that. And you can apply lime, but lime actually is best applied, A, in living form, I'll mention that in a minute, or B, through the compost pile. In other words, when you're building the compost pile, you put a dusting of lime throughout the pile, a layer of manure, a layer of vegetation, a layer, a sprinkle of rock powder, or a sprinkle of basalt powder, or a sprinkle of lime, depending. Yes, sir.
The rock dust you're talking about, that's the stuff they take out of little quarry ponds and set off to the side?
Yeah. They grind the rocks, and they wash the gravel, and they have a certain residue, and it goes into their pond. And it's, for most quarries, it's a waste product. They might charge you for a pickup load, but it's a waste product. You can go to any quarry and ask to see an analysis of their material. It's a state law, every state. They don't like to cooperate because they have to look in the file somewhere and try to find a copy of it, but by law, they have to have it available. So you look at that, mostly the quarries, the major component will be silica in high percentage, and then various trace elements. You want to find quarry dust that has a lot of trace elements. Your best source for those is a basalt quarry. Basalt is a volcanic rock powder. I don't know how many quarries in North Carolina started out volcanic in nature, but there have to be at least some. I haven't tracked any down yet. This is an interesting book in partnership with nature. It's been around for quite a while. They do give you a nice little dissertation on the plants. But one of the things that this author did, he built boxes, very narrow, with glass sides, so you could see how the roots grew. And this is pictures of the same plant growing in different mixtures of soil. This is with biodynamic compost, I think. Anyway, very interesting. to observe what's taking place beneath the soil. And you see more of that in biodynamics. This is two different tomato plants, one treated biodynamically and one not. So, interesting. Okay, I had a few questions during the little break, and I mentioned the compost activator. I did not mention the field activator. This was Pfeiffer's effort to address the larger farms that couldn't get into the actual use of the preparations because it was too overwhelming. So this is a compound preparation, contains 500 and all the 6 compost preparations, and in our case it also contains equisetum. This is a one-stop, takes care of everything type thing that you apply to your fields, your pastures, whatever. And it requires no stirring. You just moisten it ahead of time and then add more water to it and spray it out over your field. An early anecdote of that, fellow sprayed this on a 40-acre field, and when he sprayed, towards the end of the field, he kind of ran out. He didn't get a couple of acres of the 40 acres. He didn't get this applied. The next year, he was plowing that field, and it was going along nice and smooth, and all of a sudden, it's like he hit a concrete wall. And it finally dawned on him that that's the part where the spray ran out. So it made that much difference. Actually, if you use this, you wouldn't have to have as high a horsepower tractor to pull your plow or your disc. So it makes a difference in the soil, and it can do it in one season. But you don't see what's happening because most of the action is taking place beneath the soil. And this is a compost pile in our yard and garden. Yeah, you can show it around. And that's had the compost preparations in it. It also had the compost activator applied, so it'll be ready to use shortly.
Are those preparations available for people to purchase somewhere?
Yes. Yeah, from me. JPI has a version. Ours has a couple of additions to it.
Do you have it here or do you have more?
I have some here, yes. Now, I will go a little far afield. These are the instructions for making a compost pile. You can either make it with the individual preparations or you can use the material that comes with the compost activator or the field activator. I didn't pass these out because I can do so. Would you all like a copy of these? This is a description I wrote for a particular group of potential clients, the Amish, who are a little bit leery of things that are as dilute as this, such as homeopathy. And they, unless the bishop has approved it in their particular congregation or group of congregations, they're reluctant to consider it. But by describing it in such a way that we do not refer to the word biodynamic or to anything of a spiritual natures, keep it all in the material plane for them, because in spite of their, shall we say, close-knit religious practice, they tend to be pretty materialistic. So they want things described to them in the physical. And
Can I ask you, is there one of these books that talks about how Steiner received this information?
I think the closest one to that might be this one that says the birth of the biodynamic method. This is, no, I'm sorry, this is not the right one. There might be a little bit in here about it. Particularly Pfeiffer's introduction, will describe that. Rudolf Steiner was what we would call a seer. He could see into spiritual worlds, and he proposed a methodology or an approach where anyone could arrive at that destination. How to Know Higher Worlds is one of those. I think in Outline of Esoteric Science and Theosophy, those are three of his basic books. I've read them all. I have not become enlightened to the extent he did, I'm sorry to say. Maybe next lifetime I'll have a chance. But he was blessed with an awareness of other dimensions that most of us have not yet achieved. He could hold a dialogue with spiritual beings. One of the things that is postulated, I don't know that he actually said anything along these lines himself, but to do the agriculture course, he was approached by a number of farmers that were in his anthroposophical organization who wanted answers to the problems they were already having in agriculture in 1920s, which was they were using chemical fertilizers, not at all to the same extent we now are, and they noticed that they could not keep alfalfa in a field longer than 7 years. I don't know what the duration of an alfalfa planting is now. I think it's well less than 7 years. But they used to keep it for much longer than that. But the soils were deteriorating. They could not do that any longer. The animal health was sort of going downhill. They had a hoof and mouth disease impact somewhere in Europe a year or two, or maybe a little bit more, before he actually gave the agriculture course in 1924. And they asked for help in agriculture, the farmers did, and the soil scientists. And he hesitated, or seemingly hesitated. And one of the things that is postulated or speculated about as to what he did is he held a dialogue with Mother Earth, or in his phraseology, with the goddess Natura, the being that was responsible for what happens on the earth in nature. And so that's where the impulse or the information came that resulted in the agriculture course. I was blessed in a way. I first came across the agriculture course in a health food store in College Park, Maryland. And the first thing I read when I opened it up was his conversation in the preface introduction by Pfeiffer as to the need to use these preparations as widely in the earth as possible so that the earth may be healed. That became the motto for the Josephine Porter Institute when I founded that. It is, to a certain extent, still my motto, and it's why I am willing to share as much as I know with people about how to make their own preparations, because until we get a lot of people out there using them and ultimately making them as well, it's not going to happen, and we're way behind schedule. He was very concerned, and I cover this in this book, my introduction. He was very concerned that these preparations be used before the end of the century. All right, that's already passed. We're 19 years past it already. And we got a long way to go, because biodynamics, it is in the world, but it's not very stoutly in the world, and it's definitely not very stout in this country. And that's why the workshop that we have, one in June over a weekend and one in the fall, we call Fall Practicum. We go into great detail about making preparations, and we show and have you make the preparations so that you get past your whatever barrier there might be about dealing with this strange stuff, because it is strange. No way of getting around it. but it works. And the only way you know it works is if you use it. And the only way you can really learn about the preparations is to make them. I urge people to start out first with just making the 500 and the 501. If that's all you can do, anybody can bury a few cow horns with some cow manure. If you don't know where to get cow manure, I think just ask around. You can find it. It should be from a lactating cow, ideally. In the fall of the year. And the silica, the quartz, can be from quartz rock on your own property. I've used milky quartz. I've experimented widely with different forms of rock, silica rock. I have no firm conclusion to draw as to which is best, one over the other, but maybe, again, that's a task for next lifetime, too. At any rate, one of the things I've focused on is teaching other people to make them, and beyond that, trying to be creative with the preparations. I came up with the sequential spray back in 1988, 89. I also put together everything I could find about using seed baths, seed soaks. You will get better germination from your seed if you have a greenhouse operation and you're producing a lot of plants. If you're growing for sale to a farmer's market or whatever, you can get faster germination, faster turnaround in your crops or your plants if you do a seed bath. It's pretty simple to do, and ultimately greater production. The thing that is claimed in biodynamics is that yes, you can produce good quality, but you can't quite produce the quantity. Well, I've done a couple of experiments using the preparations in which I think that I can get much greater production of your crop. I did it with snow peas along a garden fence. One group of plants treated with the dandelion preparation, another one not. I've done seed soaks with a soybean grower in Wisconsin. He did pretty large quantities of acreage in soybeans. He got very much increased production by doing a seed bath with the chamomile preparation. More pods to the plant, more seeds to the pod. And I don't know anymore what the figures were on his increase in production, but he was impressed. I think he's long since retired, and maybe he's checking out things from the other side, but it's possible. Persuading people to have the courage to use the preparations is one of the most difficult things. Now, I asked earlier if anyone here had used the preparations, and basically, you've heard about them before now, right? But you haven't used them. I'm one of the people that wants to make them accessible to you. I'm not the only one. JPI was another effort I founded in 1984 to make them accessible to people. There are folks in Colorado, there are biodynamic groups in Oregon and in California and in Wisconsin that are trying to make people more acquainted with these preparations. So I'm not the only one that has that hope of spreading the preparations as widely as possible, but we're pretty far behind in that task. Yes?
So if you're hanging up animal parts or burying them in the ground, how do you keep critters from eating it? I feel like it would attract a lot of different wildlife.
Well, with the skull of the domestic animal, we put them in a kind of a swampy area, and I put all kinds of metal fencing on top of that it's wet mud, and that mostly works. When I first moved to Woolwine, probably about 3 or 4 years after I was there, we were invited to a meal with our neighbor and his wife, and he mentioned that, my dogs brought me a couple of skulls. Would you know anything about those? And I said, well, maybe. What happened to them? He says, well, I took them to the landfill. So the biodynamic preparations are working in the Patrick County landfill. Okay, but I added a little bit more metal protection around that spot. With some of the preparations, I actually placed them in, the bladder, the stag bladder for yarrow, I put in copper screening. Just staple it shut. Some of the other preparations, I do hardware cloth over the peat moss that, or the compost, whatever material I have buried the preparations in. You want to bury the preparations in a fertile spot, fertile soil. That's the main requirement. At any rate, you want to protect them. They can. Over the years, I've had practitioners who make their own preparations call me and say, look, the fox seems to have eaten up my dandelion preparation or my chamomile preparation. So, yeah, you got to protect it. So, that's a requirement. You'll learn soon enough. Would like to mention a couple of other things. My wife is a naturopathic doctor. She's been interested in the preparations for years, long before we met, of course. But we have made some experimental preparations that we refer to as Booty 1 now. This one doesn't have that label. This has got BD 500 in it at a homeopathic dosage, along with some other homeopathic like arnica. We call that Booty 1. It has actually been used by a few people who have agreed to experiment with it, but at least one person has found that it has been very helpful for someone with essential tremors, Parkinson's, or whatever. So we know it has some positive effect. We're not claiming it's a medicine or anything like that. It addresses the other dimensions, as it were, which Steiner referred to as we as a human being, we have several bodies. All we really see is the physical body. We have a life body. One of the terms he used for that was etheric. We have an emotional body, which is expressing itself rather strongly in this day and age. We have an emotional body. Steiner referred to that. His terminology was astral body, astral of the stars. And then we have a spiritual body, and each of these bodies has other aspects to it. So those, a spiritual body or an ego body is the term he sometimes used. So we think that these Booty 1, 2, and 3 address various aspects of these other bodies. Proving that is virtually impossible, and we're not really trying. We're trying to see if, for those that are interested, that care to work with it, we need feedback as to what effects they might have. And my wife can probably tell you more about what effects could be expected than I can. But one of the things that Steiner did with the agricultural section of the Anthroposophical Society in Dornach, Switzerland, he had hoped to combine that with the medical section. And so one can infer from that he saw these 9 preparations as potential for dealing with problems of human health as well. And apparently the 500 has been experimented with others in Europe for this problem of essential tremors or Parkinson's or similar diseases. Apparently, Steiner had in mind that if these two were combined, that agriculture and medicine would sort of mesh and work together. Because of the personalities involved, that didn't quite happen. So maybe it'll happen at some point in the future. If I come back in a couple of 100, 300, 400, 500 years, whatever, that might have already taken place. But the main thing right now in agriculture is to get the preparations used as widely as possible. We'll worry about whether it affects other disciplines, such as medicine. We'll worry about that later on. We have a pretty large task to do right now.